Okay, I'm a neuropsychologist, so I study how the brain works and how it can go wrong. And the thing I've done is to develop a new way of working out how the front of the brain works, and it's using virtual reality. And effectively, it looks like a computer game where someone wanders around using the mouse, picking things up, putting them down like you would in a computer game. And the thing is that I've done it to look at how human behavior to do with planning, making decisions, and things like that works. The reason being because the current tests that people in clinics use aren't very good. So they're not very helpful for helping patients who've had brain injury. So that's what the overall thing is that I've done. And then having worked with people with brain damage, I've used the same test to look at the effect of things like alcohol, nicotine, recreational drugs, and how they also affect the front of the brain, because all of these things are in our blood system, so they go to the brain and they affect the way the brain works. Because it's very important to know how what we eat and what we take in impacts our brain functioning.
Now, there's a patient called EVR who was studied in Iowa in the United States who had a brain tumor in front of his brain, and that was taken out through surgery. And that created a hole in the front of his brain. And what was found is that this man passes all of the standard tests up here, and yet he is unable to live an independent life. Within 2 years of his surgery, he became bankrupt, divorced, married again, and divorced again. Now that might be bad luck, but it might be something to do with what's happened in the front of his brain.
Why virtual reality?
Very good question. The reason for the virtual reality is that it makes it easier to test people, because the background to my task is that the current tasks aren't very good for helping people with brain damage, and you can test people in the real world by taking them to a shopping centre and see whether they know which shop to go to first and make the decisions of which thing to buy and things like that. But that's actually very costly, and it's quite difficult to do in a safe environment. Virtual reality allows you to do virtually the same thing, but in a safe way and a way that you can control. And it means that I can work with people around the world by just sending them my assessment by email. So I've worked with people around the world without even meeting them.
And it's a reproduction of an amazing accident that happened in 1848 in Vermont, where a man called Phineas Gage was working on a railroad, and a tamping iron about an inch thick flew up through his left cheek, went through the middle of his head. The iron bar was travelling so fast that it flew 20 feet into the air. That's how fast it was going when it went through his face. Unsurprisingly, he fell over. Surprisingly, he survived, and he was able to talk later on, walk, remember things, his vision worked fine, etc. So initially, one would get the sense that the front of the brain, where the iron bar went through, was useless. It was like the appendix. He could do everything, it seemed. But then what happened is that this man, who was very reliable, church-going, financially astute, etc., became someone who was very disorganized, ruined himself financially, became very uncouth, urinated in public, etc. So his behavior completely changed. And a psychologist that was working with him, or a neurologist who was working with him at the time, said that Gage was no longer Gage. And that implied that there was something happening in the front of the brain that allowed us to organize behavior and possibly gave us ourselves. And maybe that's what separates us, at least at some level, to other animals.
I wouldn't say that when I first started it I had a particular aim, but I certainly do want to make a difference, because if we can create something that people in the clinics use, then they can help patients with brain damage for assessing them, for developing better methods of working out what's gone wrong with them after a stroke or after an accident or something like that. And once they have a better idea of what's gone wrong with them after the brain damage, they'll be able to help them better in rehabilitation. So I think it's very applied research, the idea being that once you know what someone can and cannot do, you have a better chance of actually helping them. So yes, I do want to make that change.
the data that we can access is only the data that's published by academics, often. So it's really hard to get your hands on the raw data and have a play with it. But that's something that we're actually now thinking maybe that's what we need to start doing. Because I think what we're doing, nobody else is doing.
I'm in the School of Health and Bioscience, and I'm director of the Medicines Research Group, and we're looking at recreational drugs, and we're looking at it from a consumer perspective. So we think a lot of what's on the market basically doesn't do what it says in the tin. So we've been working with students, looking at research projects, doing the chemistry behind what's actually on the market, and finding out that it's quite variable. So if you're going to pay money for recreational drugs, some of the work we're doing is going to help people choose perhaps which brands they might want to use. In the forensic science degree, all students have to do an independent research project as part of their final year. So what I've been discussing cuts across different programs, but the message is the same. And actually it's about public understanding of chemistry, because a lot of people think chemistry is really hard. They think, oh, it's nothing to do with me. Whereas in actual fact, of course, chemistry is in everything we eat and everything we ingest and everything we drink. The students working on the project get very excited, very into the work, very motivated. Then they leave and get jobs and go elsewhere. And it's important just to be able to offer students the experience of working on these projects, that they're never going to get the opportunity to work on projects like this again, chances are, with employers. So yeah, it's good.
If you say to Q, who's worried about the products, the over-the-counter products in Chinatown, in Soho, in London, who's looking at the products that are salvied and bought over the internet? Q won't touch it. They'll say, well, that's over the counter, it's nothing to do with us. The MHRA will say, that's very interesting, but we have no money for research. So this is our problem, and we've actually got a really cost-effective way, an organic way, as it were, of having student projects, in fact, through forensic science. This is the only reason why we're doing this kind of work. We need projects for students. So it's organic growth, and in a sense, we will keep doing the work. Oftentimes our best projects come from the media. They come from what's in the news. They come from listening to what colleagues are doing across UEL and thinking, right, we can help answer some of those questions. So I don't know if that answers you.
The important thing to say is there's still a lot more work to be done on this before we can actually draw conclusions about causality, about the water having the effect that we think from previous research it is. So there's still more work to be done before I think we would feel really confident about making those firm recommendations. But certainly what the results suggest, and from the previous literature, we would say that students really need to think about their hydration status when they are doing things like exams, not just exams, revision as well, because the likelihood is that their hydration status is going to affect the efficiency, the effectiveness of how their brain is processing information. So the university has published some posters about the research, which you can infer exactly that message from. But beyond that, there's no specific recommendations as of yet. So with that in mind, if hydration influences cognition, we had a hypothesis that perhaps those students that take water to exams, assuming they're drinking it in the exam, might well do better. And that's what we tested. So we just, for the first study, we just observed which students brought water into the exam, and then we had a look at their exam marks that they produced in that exam, and we found that those students who brought water in also performed better. Now, importantly, that could be because those students who bring water in are just better prepared, or perhaps they are the more academically capable students. So what we also did was we recorded their coursework grades, so the marks that they'd achieved elsewhere, which we take to be a measure of their ability, their academic ability, and we co-varied the effect of that. So we controlled for the effect of that to ensure it wasn't just due to that. And the marks, the effect was retained. You will have seen that the two students that were mentioned at the end, that was two of our postgraduate students who'd been involved in this. A student intern, an undergraduate student intern, collected the data for us in the exam halls as well. The Institute for Research in Child Development hosts internships all the time, and we're always interested in hearing from students who want to do more work on this. The two students that were involved are named authors on the paper that this research is being published in. So absolutely, the more students we can get involved in these sorts of projects, the better.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much for your help.
Okay, not at all.
Cheers,
Thanks.
thank you.